In the original class, first class, we discussed all of these agenda items here, which are basically an honest discussion of the significant but surmountable challenges of mastering Gemara. And I firmly believe that if we're going to address an issue, if you want to solve something, or you want to start something the best way, the only way to do it is to discuss the barriers first. What is the barrier in the way of success? In this case, success is mastering Gemara and developing really a lifelong love for learning. And I propose that in order to do that, it's important to talk about what those barriers are. And I went through them yesterday, so I'll do them just briefly today. There's a language barrier. Kids are learning Aramaic and Hebrew, many, especially the Aramaic part, for the first time. There's no punctuation, there's no nekudos. The comma, in English we would say commas and periods and paragraphs. There's very little of that in the Gemara. And my recommendation for the first two was that I believe that at the beginning we should learn from a Gemara that does have nekudos, that does have punctuation, and that it has translation. The big idea of all of this is to eliminate as many barriers as possible, number one. And number two, and equally as important, is to only teach one thing at a time. This is really critical to understanding this whole introduction to Gemara thing. Many times when we know something and we're trying to teach it to someone else, sometimes we delude ourselves into thinking that it's actually possible or optimal to learn many things at once, or two things at once. And that's not the way it does. I mean, that's not the way it works. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're getting a recipe, okay? You're not naturally good at baking or cooking, but you have this aunt in London, and you call for the recipe, okay? Now, European countries typically use a metric system. Now, imagine that she doesn't tell you about the metric system, how it works and all of that beforehand, but she just jumps into the recipe, and in the middle, just imagine, okay, so you take 1.5 kilograms of flour, and you say, whoa, what's a kilogram? Oh, a kilogram, it's just a different system. Just look it up online. You can get a conversion table. We use the metric system. What's the metric system? Check it up later. It's no big deal. Anyway, you take 1.5 kilograms, or perhaps even worse is if you tell the person a little bit about this kilogram thing. You said there's grams instead of pounds. We have kilograms, and instead of miles, we have kilometers, and a kilo means 1,000. And in the meantime, you're flooding the person with information, and then you're expected to remember the recipe. That's not how it works. So my philosophy is that every one of these things here in this list should preferably be done before they start Gemara, or deal with it at a later time. And when I say before they start Gemara, meaning have them be fluent in whatever you're thinking of teaching them, and only then do you start expecting them to know it, and then you can start teaching the Gemara itself. But to teach Gemara at the same time as you're explaining who these people are, and number 3, I'm going through the list, okay? Insider talk, that means, the knowledge base that you need to understand everything. Changing the analogies to something that's relevant in the children's lives. Tonight we're going to be doing logical thread, and that's number 6, which I highlighted. It means follow the logical thread, the bouncing ball of the Gemara's deductive reasoning. And there are many steps to it, again, before they start Gemara, so that when they start Gemara, they recognize the steps that they've already learned well. Now, this is from the Introduction to Gemara book, our Bright Beginnings book, authored by Rabbi Spivak. And here in lesson 6 of this book, it discusses, I'm using the cursor instead of coloring, so it'll be easier to follow. So you see the sugya topic is made of Shakla V'tarya. By the way, the children have already learned these translation words. And Shakla V'tarya just means the steps that are used in order to understand the Gemara. And Rabbi Spivak had actually a brilliant way to explain this to the children. And he used this paragraph here, okay? David asked his brother Chaim, do you know what mommy's making for supper? Chaim answers, we're having hamburgers. I know this because I saw mommy take ground beef out of the freezer. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Maybe we're having meatballs. Chaim says, well, I saw her buy hamburger buns. Okay, now there are 5 specific steps in this. And, you know, I had the privilege as the founding dean of Yeshiva Dar Chanoim, Rabbi Spivak was a Rebbe there for over 10 years while I was there. And I had the pleasure of walking into his classroom many times. And very often, when later in the year, when he would get to a question or a raya, a proof, the children would say, oh, you mean it was like the hamburgers, right? When they answered, see, because they already had accumulated this knowledge. And if you look here on the green section, you see these are the 5 steps. She'ela is a request for information. We call it a she'ela's birur. We use that rather than the term kasha. Kasha usually is when you compare 2 things and ask a question on it. Okay, Chaim answers, we're having hamburgers. That's an answer. That's a teretz. It's a response to his question. And he brings a proof. A raya is a proof. He says, I saw mommy taking ground beef out of the freezer. Okay, so David says, a dechia. Dechia literally means to push. So he's pushing away this answer, the proof that he brought, by saying, well, maybe it's meatballs. Chaim answers with a proof, and he says, no, I'm proving what I said before because mommy brought hamburger buns. Okay, so here you have the 5 steps of a Shakla V'tarya, of a back and forth in Gemara. Again, this is going to be on YouTube. You can stop, take screenshots. So you can take screenshots now so that you can look at it in greater detail. Okay, so here we have, now I'm going to a different part of this and to see how the logical components stack up. One of the things, and this is from the introduction to Elam Metzias books, and this is a really important logical flow. And Rabbi Spivak once again came up with an adorable analogy. And what this flowchart says is that, the flowchart is talking about the how discussions come about. We discussed yesterday the transmission of the way it came from Moshe Rabbeinu to Yeshua. Yeshua, passed it on to subsequent generations, and eventually they wrote down Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Until then, it was Torah Sheba'al Peh. It was repeated orally, and then Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the great, he was referred to as Rebbe. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi realized that the Torah is going to be forgotten. The chain of Masara was getting frayed, and they decided to write it down. So they accumulated all of this knowledge and divided it up into sections. Again, please refer back to part 1 of this series, Introduction to Gemara. You'll see it there. But very often, what happens in a discussion is an Amira, is one of the Chachamim that spoke about Gemara. He makes a statement, and someone comes along with a question, and he says, hey, I learned differently. I learned from my Rebbe, from Atana. Atana was a generation, was before Tanaim wrote the Mishnah, Amirayim wrote the Gemara. And the rule of thumb is that once the Mishnah was set, an Amara was not permitted to argue with the ruling of Atana unless he was agreeing with something that a different Tana said. Okay, so someone would come along and ask and offer a different idea. And therefore, to answer this, there are 2 options. Option number 1 is he says, well, I have a brisa, I have a quote from a different Chacham, a different scholar, that supports what I said and not what you said. In that case, there is what we call a machlokes, a disagreement, and we have methods for resolving that. Or it could actually be talking in a situation where they're talking about 2 different situations, meaning that they did say different rulings, but there were different situations there. So Rebbe has this adorable idea about explaining it through potato chips. Okay, you always try to get the analogies as close to the kids' lives as possible. So here, Rebbe says, imagine if an Amira, again, Amira is someone chacham that was involved in the writing of the Gemara. He says the correct bracha on potato chips is shahakal liya b'dvaray. Okay? Now, someone comes along and says, hey, we have a Mishnah that says that there's a bracha of bar pri adama. Okay, so here, the chacham on the left, the Amora on the left says that the halacha is a bar shahakal liya b'dvaray, and his friend says no, but we have a Mishnah that says it's bar pri adama. So an Amora cannot argue with the Tana, so there's a bit of a problem here. So one way is saying, he says, well, I have shita means a ruling, I follow somebody else's ruling, or it's actually two different realities. Mishnah, one quote from a Talmud Chacham of a previous generation was talking about Pringles. Pringles are made, you see on the bottom, from powdered potatoes. So therefore, since it loses, most poskim say, most rabbinic rulings are that since it doesn't look like a potato anymore, it was kind of crushed and lost its form, you make the bracha for general things, which is a shakal liya b'dvaray. Shakal liya b'dvaray means everything was created through the word of Hashem. So if something isn't a ha'etz from the earth, hadama, for a tree, hadama from the ground, or bar pri agafen on wine, if something doesn't belong to that category, like drinks or meat, you automatically make a shahakal. And the Mishnah could have been talking about a regular potato chips, in which case it would be a bar pri adama. So those are the two ways of resolving a conflict. Either you could say it is a conflict, in fact, and there are two different rulings on this, or we say that they were actually talking about two completely different cases. Now, if we look ahead, I'm going to go ahead to shiur 7. This is part of the introduction to Gemara book. Back over here, if you just want to take a screenshot of this, I'll leave it here for a moment. If you'd like to purchase the book, you can go here to BB store at thebrightbeginnings.com. That's for all of our Chumash and Gemara books. And some of the books, this one, the Introduction to Gemara, is available on ebook, on Apple's ebook. You just, if you type in the search, you do Introduction, Gemara Spivak, and it'll come right up. Okay? So what I'm going to walk you through now is this Shakla V'tarya, the give and take, and some of the different components of the Gemara. Now, if you remember back over here when we did the this hamburger thing, right? We had 5 steps: a she'ela, a teretz, a raya, a question, a request for information, a response to the question, a proof to that. The proof was refuted, and then the proof was again solidified. Here, what we did throughout our Bright Beginnings books is that the coloring and the icons project exactly what type of logical component it is, and then you're able to pull it together. And once you have these logical components, it's much easier to arrange them in a sequence. So a memra is a statement. Okay, the sugi starts with opening a statement, a fact, a halacha. Halacha is Jewish law. Okay, so that's a green icon with a quote here. We have a kasha, a question, constructed as a bomb. It's something that just seems to be not understandable. We say, well, how could this be? And a teretz is an answer, again, a shield. So the icons is just a visual icon, and the coloring and the wording here are just cues for the kids. Rabbi Vivek gave an example of what Gemara would sound like. So you have step 1, an Amora makes a statement. The correct bracha is shakal liya b'dvaray. Again, that was back our discussion about potato chips. So if this were a Gemara, the way this logic would work is the statement would be the bracha is shakal liya b'dvaray. Someone comes along and asks a question, yes, but I have a Mishnah written by a Tana that says it's a bar pri adama. And there's a lot of research that these, again, it's made for kids, that these visual cues really triggers, thinking. So throughout the workbook series, when there are two things in conflict, the Mishnah is the one that's asking the kasha. So the initial one that says it's Shakla V'tarya is demolished by the Bar Priyadama. So again, that's just a visual cue for two things in conflict with each other. And three is we resolve it by saying that it's either powdered potatoes or sliced potatoes, in which case there is no question, or it just goes on two different, it's talking about two different situations, or it's actually a machlokes. And the workbook does have all sorts of questions of higher order thinking skills, different types of questions, just to not only, in other words, that the review questions are much more helpful when they have different formats to them, when they're not all thinking in the same way. You have true or false, you have fill in information, follow the Shakla V'tarya. So all of this, again, is helpful for picking up information and recording in a different way. And we have the other logical components are also listed here. If it pulls up, here we go. Okay, so we ended with 3. So we have a raya is a proof, like we had in that case with the hamburgers, right? He said, "Mommy's making hamburgers because I saw she took meat out of the freezer," and then the question came on that. Okay, so there are other logical components. The chia is what we learned, which is a push. To push away the proof. She'ela is what we said, she'ela's bir is a question, tshuva is a response, and finally a maskana is a final conclusion. And the book, Rabbi Spivak walks you through what it looks like here. Step 4 is quoting a brisa here, like with the potato chips, and then we come with a final maskana. And again, this I'm just going to tell you, since we're talking about these logical steps, before I give you one final way of looking at an analogy, I just want to share with you, many, many years ago, when I was in Eretz Yisrael, there's a very big Talmud Chacham. His name is Rabbi Silber, and he lives in Eretz Yisrael, and I believe, certainly at the time, he was the most prolific Magid Shiur, one who gave classes in the Daf Yomi. The Daf Yomi was a program started by Rabbi Meir Shapiro in Europe, where everybody learns a page of Gemara a day. And we just recently had a siyum, a celebration of finishing all of Gemara. Anyway, there was a lot of buzz because they I think it was the first time, it was a number of years ago. They took Binyanei HaUma, which is a stadium right in the middle of Yerushalayim, and they rented the stadium and they made a big party there. And the secular general Israeli media was all over this. So I heard on the radio, I heard an interview on Kol Yisrael, the general radio station of Israel, and they were interviewing Rabbi Silver, and they asked him, they said, "Tell me, how did you become you? How did you become you? What made you, were you brilliant as a kid, or just going through his history?" And I just stopped when he said it. He said, really, I was average. I don't think I was, a great Talmud Chacham, a scholar. I was probably just an average kid learning. He said, but one thing I did, whenever I finished the Gemara, he described exactly this process. He said, whenever I finished the Gemara, I would sit down and write down every component of it, and the question, answer, proof, refuting the proof. And he said, I didn't leave until I absolutely knew it. And that really lends a lot of credence to the notion that doing this in an organized fashion, is really helpful. Going back here just to the beginning, I mentioned, Rebbe did a great job with the potato chips. Look at number 5 with the barriers that I mentioned before. Is that an additional barrier is that the references discussed in Gemara are from that time period. And obviously, from that time period, that's the way it is. But, references get very dated quickly. And if the Gemara is talking about oxen causing damage, the equivalent today would be a car crash. So I just encourage you, don't think that it's any less respectful of Gemara if you bring analogies in, or you bring bring a richness to the discussion by making it living relevant to what the kids are living through, I think it's an important thing to do. Please don't take it as that. Obviously, you have to know your audience, but it really is helpful when you can bring something that's relevant to the children's lives. Just throwing another idea out for parents. One of the things that I used to do in my classroom, I taught 8th grade for 15 years before I started the Shakla V'tarya. So one of the things that I always did in my classroom is before we started a new piece of Gemara, I would try to find something to put up on the board when the kids walked in that would be relevant to whatever they were learning about. And I, I used to always look for things that would be, pre-internet, certainly pre-Google. This was something, I actually showed this in lesson number 1. This is an article in the New York Times that about state line city, state line road, that there's a road that straddles 2 states, and people across the street from each other wind up going to school in different directions. This is very relevant to discussions about Ir Miklat, the city of refuge, where there was a specific border, and there are discussions about, a tree with branches on one side and a trunk on another side. So this is just a point of interest. So I encourage you to be as creative as you can. And like I said, there are those who might say that we should just learn the Gemara. And if your Talmidim, if your students are doing that, great. But my experience has been that even with adults, it is very helpful. I just a couple of days ago, I was thinking of creating, Rabbi Spivak did that with the potato chips. So I actually found this, don't ask me how this came about, but President Obama, when Osama bin Laden was captured, I'm just giving you some background to understand this is fascinating, because it really does follow a lot of the logical flow similar to the Gemara. This is something that I would have done in my classroom. Okay, so President Obama was asked at a news conference when he announced that Osama bin Laden was killed. Osama bin Laden was the guy who was behind the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City. Of course, it was a great celebration in America when he was captured and killed. So someone a reporter at the news conference said, "Well, are you going to show the body?" In other words, people, they might not believe you that you really, might not believe the Americans that we actually killed him. So he said, we don't need to spike the football. Okay? We don't need to spike the football. That's what he said in his quote. In fact, here it is. President Obama, I pulled this from a different place, made the following statement regarding his decision not to show the dead body of Osama bin Laden. I think Americans and people around the world are glad that he's gone, but we don't need to spike the football. We'll leave the discussion. And I think the graphic nature of these photos, because he was bloody and everything, it would create some national security risk, meaning the terrorists might be more, energized and inspired to go kill Americans. So he decided not to do it. And what was interesting is, so up on the internet, people were trying to figure out what that meant. President Obama used language that's good for an American football fan. But by the way, just look, football means something else in Europe. They call soccer football. And the term spike is okay, so look at this. So this was actually from a chat that someone said, President Obama made this statement, okay, that what I just showed you before. And now he said, so what does spike the football mean? So he says it's a quarterback throws the ball straight into the ground after a snap. That means as soon as a quarterback, he's like the leader of the team, he takes the ball and throws it into the ground, okay? Now, what was puzzling to them, he says, so what American football, and he asks, what does this mean? So look on the bottom, another person says, well, American football, you can stop the clock when you're running out of time. I'm not even gonna go there. There are lots and lots of rules about that, but that is true. So that would be a spiking, that would be what one interpretation of spiking the football. Okay, here's the quarterback over here where the cursor is. So he takes the ball and throws it into the ground. Now, the problem is that doesn't have anything to do with what President Obama said. What does that have to do with stopping the clock? However, if you look around, there's actually two meanings for the word spike the football. like the potato chips, okay? So here, in American football, new word suggestion, when a player scores a touchdown, he slams the ball to the ground in the end zone, also used as an expression of celebration and victory. So now, this statement that President Obama said, he said, we don't need to spike the football, means we won this, we got him, we killed him. We don't have to spike the football, we don't have to make a celebratory dance that might endanger other soldiers, okay? So so this is what a football spike looks like, right? The referee raises his hands, that means they scored a touchdown. The player gets to throw the ball into the ground. They can't celebrate too much, they get penalized, but that's the end of that. And if you look at the Wikipedia, if you look up the word spike, by the way, gridiron football, that's American football, as opposed to soccer. And this is another, I think, my final real message before I close to parents is about the background information. If you look here, look, a gridiron football, a spike is a play where the quarterback throws the ball to the ground. That's what we had at the beginning, right? What didn't make sense with Obama. If you look on the bottom, spiking after scoring a touchdown. So they celebrate a different way in football. This is really, really important because if you look at number 4, that one of the barriers, I discussed it in the previous one, but I really want to drill down on this now because we're giving examples where there's a lot of information out there that people need to know. Now, here it says, everyone in Gemara speaks an insider talk. What does that mean? That means the people who created the Gemara, and by definition, they knew a lot of things. You know, they knew a lot of Jewish law, they knew halachas, they knew Aramaic, they knew a lot of Mishnah, a lot of Navi, a lot of, words of our prophets, a lot of Chumash, the Bible. So they had a lot of this, as my friend Dr. Dan Schwartz says, they started on the 4th floor. So this is an elevator. These classes and the Gemara, I'm starting Gemara classes tomorrow on Gemara Brachas, are intended to get you up to the 4th floor from the ground floor. But just to prove, I think this is another reason that I took this football thing, because it just gives you an idea of how much background information is needed to just follow a simple conversation. If somebody talks about spiking the ball, I really think this is a good example because every one of these blue things is a link. In other words, if you say, well, the quarterback throws it into the ground, I didn't explain what the quarterback meant, okay? And if you're in Europe, football is confusing because football means soccer, what we call soccer. And you have to learn what a snap is and a clock management, incomplete pass. None of these things make sense. Even if you have a translation and you have an explanation. In other words, let's go back to the beginning. If you were constructing this as the similar way, the way a logical flow goes, I didn't map it out like that. But the question would be, someone would say, what does spike the football mean? My spike, right? So you'd say, well, he says spike means that the quarterback throws it into the ground. And then you say, well, what does that have to do with Obama? It doesn't make sense. Well, you say, actually, there's another type of spike. And this is what it looks like, okay? And then but look at all the background information that's needed in order to master this. So my final message to parents and educators, when you're teaching kids Gemara, and they're starting with a new language and no punctuation and insider talk and analogies from a long time, minimize the barriers as much as possible and try to give kids the information and try to teach them this beforehand. In other words, if you know that you're having a discussion with a quarterback, don't tell them this now because they're trying to comprehend what Obama said, what President Obama said. This is really important. I spoke at the beginning about not trying to teach two things at once. It's really important because if you try to teach it now, I can almost guarantee you, if you don't know anything about football, and I started explaining this one at a time while I was going through, and while you're trying to remember the correlation to President Obama's spiking the football message, you get so overwhelmed. And again, some people can follow it, many people can't. And as an educator and as a parent, trying to help your child, your goal is to try to minimize as much as possible anything that might limit the learning. I hope you found this helpful. Again, we're starting a series of classes on actual Gemara brachos, where we're going to show many of these tools. That's why I did the introduction first before the Gemara, because I wanted to explain these things before we actually get into Gemara. Hope you found it helpful, and look forward to seeing you when we start learning Gemara brachos. Thank you.